back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, coming back at you with more VMware. That's right, the VMware Certified Professional version 6. Have you ever run into a situation where you've installed a piece of software, server comes online and it crashes? Now what do you have to do? You have to build the server over again. Well, that's our topic today. It can help you out in that area, and joining me in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing swell, Wes, and definitely glad that my server isn't crashed today. If it were, building it over again, that's like the worst thing to have to do, right? You never want to have to rebuild everything from scratch. And so what we're going to see in this episode and the next couple episodes are things that we can do to prevent that from happening in the first place. Well, maybe the problem happens, but prevent us from having to rebuild, right? Ways to quickly restore a server and get it back up and running just by taking a few precautionary measures. So in this episode, we're going to talk about one of those technologies, one of the most useful. They're called Snapshots. Now, a lot of you might already be familiar with Snapshots. You might have used them in other products, and that's great. For the exam, we need to know how they actually work, though, and how vSphere, or ESXi really, applies the snapshots and gets them in place. So let's start off really basic here with what the heck a snapshot is, right? If you've ever done, let me just give you an example, right? We'll use Windows, because Windows is easy to break. So way back in the day, I had to do a deployment of Windows NT 4.0, right? So this was a long time ago, 15 years ago. And when a new service pack would come out for NT4, Microsoft wasn't as good at doing quality control back then as they are now. And so when you deployed a service pack, there was a good 50% chance that server would break. And so if I had a server and I deployed a service pack, say it was service pack 4, well, it would take 30 minutes to get it installed, and if it crashed anywhere in that 30-minute period, the server was dead in the water. And what did I have to do? Format the server and restore it from backup tape. And so what took me just 15 or 30 minutes to break would then take 2 or 3 hours for me to restore and get back online. That was a nightmare. So what a snapshot does is it tries to fix that for us and says, what we can do is we can freeze the hard drives on a server at a particular point in time. We can take a picture, of that hard drive. You gotta have the sound effect, it's important. And so this is what the hard drive looked like at this point in time. And then you go and you start making your changes. You deploy your service pack. You do whatever change it is you need to do to the system. And then if something goes wrong, then you say, oh, shoot, let me just go back in time. Take me back to the way that drive was when I took the snapshot, and everything you just did is undone, and the world is back. You've achieved peace and state of zen, and off you go, right? What it does is it removes a lot of fear. It gives you a safety net. When I was deploying those service packs back then, I always had that fear. I knew if something went wrong, I was going to have at least 3 hours of work to restore the backups and then verify and certify the server to say now it's working again the way that it was supposed to. And then I still had more work down the road because I'd have to redo the service pack eventually. But with a snapshot, I can give it a shot. I can give it an attempt. And if something goes wrong, it only takes a matter of seconds to restore a snapshot, and you're back. So that fear of having to do all this restore work, it just goes out the window, right? So snapshots are really, really great. But you need to understand how they work, because there's a negative side, there's a dark side to snapshots. And some people go a little snapshot crazy, and it kills the performance of their virtual machines. So we've got to be careful with that. And to make sure that we understand it, I made some little diagrams that show how snapshots work to make sure we understand it, and you'll be able to see where it really starts to hurt performance. Okay. So let's start with a traditional virtual machine. When I make a virtual machine on ESX, that virtual machine is going to have at least one hard drive. And that hard drive is stored in a VMDK, right, a virtual machine disk file. And that disk file is where all of our disk contents go. They get stored in that file. So I've got a really simplistic diagram here. So let's say that I've got a virtual machine, and here's my hard drive at 6 a.m. Okay, my hard drive has a lot of data in it, but it has some empty space down here at the end. And so you'll see where I've written A, B, C, D, E. This just represents data on my disk. Okay, so as of 6 a.m., this is what my server looks like. If I start making changes to the disk, so maybe I overwrite whatever is stored here in D and I make that F, right? Well, I just changed it. Can I roll back and go back to when it had D? No. I mean, maybe if this is Windows, I might have a recycle bin. I go and restore the file I deleted or whatever. Or if it's a Mac, you can go and go into something and get that data back. But if you don't have Time Machine set up on your Mac, you can't go back. On Windows, if you don't have a backup, you can't go back. I guess Windows, you have volume shadow copy and other technologies you might be able to use. But in Linux, you don't have anything. Once I delete that file and change it, it's gone. And so I'd have to go and restore from a backup. And that's not necessarily something that I want to do. So what I can do is I can take a snapshot of that drive. I can freeze it at this point in time. I can freeze it at 6 a.m. And at 6 a.m. I had A, B, C, D, and E written in it. And then once it's frozen, now I can start making changes, and I'll have a reference point that I can jump back to.
Now, Don, when you say frozen here, I'm certain it's not the Antarctic we're talking about here. What do you mean when you say I'm going to freeze this drive? What are we doing there?
All right, when you take a snapshot, there's actually 3 different things that happen. And the main one is on the disk side, what I'm talking about here. That VMDK, VMware basically makes it read-only. So it flags it as read-only so it can't be changed anymore. Now, I know what you're thinking. If the hard drive is now read-only, how am I supposed to make changes to it? What it does is it creates a second virtual hard drive. And your changes actually go in the second hard drive. And it looks something like this. So when I take that snapshot at 6 a.m., it freezes the VMDK and makes it read-only. And then it creates a new VMDK. And all of my changes are going to start getting put in here. So if I change D to F, right, I would actually be writing that here. And when I do that, let me change that. I got to have my colors right. There we go. So when I do that, the change goes here as opposed to going here. And so now if I want to roll back, I still can. I have the original data as it was at 6 a.m., but I've also got the new data changed as it was. And when we go to read from the disk, the production system, as it goes to read, it reads from that new disk. And so we would read and we would hit that F, and that's what we would see. And so when we read that sector of the drive, we'd see F. If I read from this sector of the drive, there's nothing there. And so I would pass right through and I would read C or B or A or whatever, right? You pass right through the snapshot where it's empty. You only stop at the snapshot where it actually has data, okay? Now, there's 2 things that we need to be concerned with here. First off, reads are a little more complex now, aren't they? It used to be that I just went to one VMDK and I went right to where I needed and I found the data that I wanted and that was that. Now, I might have to go to more than one VMDK. So let's say that I'm reading F. I just go to that first disk, I find it, I get the information I need, and I'm done. But if and I say it's really ESXi that's doing it, right? The virtual machine. When the virtual machine goes to read from this sector, it has to check the snapshot disk here, see that it's empty, and then go and check on the main disk. So what used to be 1 seek is now 2 seeks. I've got to seek against the snapshot and then seek against the original drive to find the original data. Only changes would be 1 seek. That means my performance is going to decrease just based on that. Just based on having to check 2 disks, I'm going to have a performance decrease because I got to go 2 places. All right. The other thing is, remember that when we provision a virtual disk, you've got a choice of thick provisioning or thin provisioning, right? And back in the storage episodes, I said, hey, thin provisioning is great during lab or research and development, but in production, you always want a thick provision, right? And just as a refresher, if I make a 64 gigabyte virtual hard drive and I thick provision it, it will find 64 gigs of space on the actual hard drive right then and lay it out and flag it for this virtual disk. And so as I start to put data in it, the disk's already 64 gigs. If the disk is empty or if the disk has 63 gigs of data in it, it's still going to consume 64 gigs no matter what. It's thick provisioned. Well, we can run out of hard drive space that way if I need a bunch of virtual hard drives, and if a drive is mostly empty, it's still going to consume its full size, so we might opt to thin provision. With thin provision, if I create a 64 gig hard drive and it's empty, it'll only take up like 100 megs on the hard drive. It won't take up much. And as I copy data into it, it'll then grow. Well, in the storage episodes, I talk about how that growth operation creates its own disk I/O and it creates overhead. And it can also lead to fragmentation of the VMDK. So you could have fragmentation in the VMDK, and now you've got fragmentation outside of the VMDK, so you've got double fragmentation, and that's bad for the file. It's bad for performance. So thin provision disks have their own provisioning, or their own performance concerns. Well, my original disk here, the disk as it's frozen here at 6 a.m., I may have thick provisioned that, right? So that's laid out at 64 gigs, it's on the hard drive. But when you take a snapshot, snapshots are always thin provisioned, right? Doesn't matter if the source is thin or thick. The snapshot is always thin provisioned. So when I take a snapshot, the new snapshot disk is empty. It'll take up a very small amount of space on the hard drive. And then as I make changes, like adding this F right here, when we change that value, it gets written and the snapshot starts to grow. And every change I make is making it grow and grow and grow. Well, it doesn't matter if you're running Linux or Windows or Mac OS or whatever, they've all got page files, right? And their page files are constantly changing. That means your snapshot is going to be constantly growing. Even if the system is just sitting there idle, there's stuff being swapped in and out of memory into the page files, and you're going to see that activity. Unless you, I mean, in theory, you could disable page files. You could disable writing syslogs to the hard drive and have it write to RAM instead. Those are things that you could do to alleviate that. But even an idle system is going to be writing data, and this is going to continue to grow, and that starts to hurt performance, right? So in a lab, in a test environment, on my laptop right here for the show, I'll go snapshot crazy. I'll take all sorts of snapshots. But in production, snapshots should always be a temporary thing, right? I'm about to deploy a service pack. So let me take a snapshot, deploy the service pack, and make sure everything works right, okay? If it doesn't, I roll back to the snapshot. Whew, problem solved, right? If things do work out though, if everything works out great, then I need to certify the server and say, yep, it's done, it's upgraded, everything's working fine, and then I need to go delete the snapshot. Delete the snapshot to get it out of there, right? And now you're just reading and writing from that one VMDK that is thick provisioned, and your performance goes back to a normal performance profile, right? Where it gets really bad is when you start adding more snapshots, right? So maybe, on this server here, I take a snapshot at 6 a.m., and then we start making changes, right? So at 7 a.m., I've changed a few of my values around. I've added some more data down here, right? Things start changing on this system. And then I take another snapshot, right? So I'm about to make another change. And so I leave my original snapshot at 6 a.m., so I take a snapshot at 7 a.m. So at 8 a.m., I got this nice blank disk, and my new changes are starting to be written to that. And so as I continue to make changes, now things can get really weird. Because if I read from the change data, I'm going to read from this guy right here, from H. And so I'm going to, well, that's not working for me, is it? So, so I'm going to read from H, and I'm going to find that right there on the first disk that I go to. But if I go and read from this sector, I see that it's empty here, and then I've got to jump down to the next disk. I had to read from 2 different virtual disks. But if I read from this next sector, I've got to go all the way to the third one. So I make 3 stops. I check here, it's empty. I check here, it's empty. I check here, I find my data. I just turned 1 seek into 3 as we reached out. Your performance gets progressively worse. The more snapshots you have, the worse your disk I/O gets, right? You may not care about that. It may be fine. Maybe it's a web server where all the web pages get cached into RAM anyway. We're not doing disk seeks, right? So create all the snapshots you want, who cares? But if it's a database server, disk I/O is really important on a database server, and the more snapshots you have, the worse your performance will get. So be careful with snapshots. In production, they should only be temporary. You temporarily use these as a safety net when you're making a significant change, all right? In a lab or R&D, use them like crazy. Have as many snapshots as you want. Things will start to get slower, but you won't notice because it's in a lab environment, all right? So that's a key thing to remember about how these snapshots work. And we can see this happening when we take a snapshot of a machine. So for example, let me get to my actual environment. All right, so here I'm in my vCenter server, and I'm going to dig into host and clusters, and I'm going to find my ESX host 01 that's buried in here. And it's got a virtual machine called WinClient 01. All right, WinClient 01 is a Windows 7 machine. And it's just running Windows 7, it's got it installed, it's got the VMware tools, and right now it's powered off. Okay, now, if I go into my storage, and I think I put that in my local data store, so let me go into my local data store here. I'm going to find that Windows 7 machine, so WinClient 01, and here's what that Windows 7 machine has right now. Okay, I've got the VMX file, that's the configuration for my machine. And then I've got the VMDK, that's my virtual machine disk. And see how it's 9.5 gigs right now? I thin provisioned it. I think I actually have it as a 64 gig disk, but I thin provisioned it. So it's only 9.5 gigs right now because That's the basic Windows 7 install with VMware tools. You end up at about 9.5 gigs. So there's that disk, right? I just have one disk. Now these other files are important too, because like NVRAM, that's like my BIOS configuration, and the VMX, that's my virtual machine configuration. When you take a snapshot, it takes a snapshot not just of the hard drives, but it also takes a snapshot of what's in RAM and the virtual machine configuration. So it'll snapshot this VMX, and if I was running, it would take a snapshot of what's in RAM. My machine's powered off. So if I take a snapshot right now, what's in RAM? Nothing. So it won't do a snapshot of the RAM. So that's important. I'll show you an example of that here in a few moments. All right, so I'm going to take a snapshot of that virtual machine. So I'm just going to go over here to WinClient01. I'm going to right-click on it and go to Snapshots, and I'll choose to take a snapshot. All right. So it's going to take the hard drive, and maybe I'm about to do something, right? So I'm about to install Google Chrome or something like that, right? So I'll call this prior to installing Google Chrome. All right. It is not a very risky operation here installing Chrome, but if we were doing a service pack or some other reconfig, this would be more significant. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Notice down here, snapshot the virtual machine's memory. See how that's not lit up? It's because it's not running. There is nothing in memory to take a snapshot of. And then beneath that, quiesce the guest file system. That's a fun one. What this means is, if the system is running, in theory, it could be writing to the hard drive right now. If I flag the drive as read-only, then I'm going to flag it halfway through a write. And the other half of that write is going to happen in the snapshot. So if I roll back to this, I could be halfway through a write operation and it can't recreate the write. It fails. I can end up with corrupt data. So if I have the VMware tools installed, it'll try and quiesce the file system, which means get Windows to slow down for a minute and stop writing to the disk. And when they stop writing to the disk, then we freeze it, and then it finishes writing to the disk afterwards. So it makes sure that we have all clean writes to the hard drive. That's another thing we don't have to worry about when the machine is powered off. If the machine is powered off, snapshots are really straightforward and they go really fast. If the machine is powered on, we have to quiesce the file system if we can, and we have to copy what's in RAM. So taking a snapshot of a running machine is a little bit more involved than taking a snapshot of a powered off machine like mine. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK and power that one on, or and take that snapshot. The snapshot's going to happen really fast. It doesn't take long. See, it's already done. And now I've got a snapshot of the system. Looking at it here, I don't really see any differences. But if I go back to the data store and pull up the file listing for that client, we're going to see some new files. All right. Originally, I just had the one VMDK. There it is. And it's still 9.5 gigs. So my virtual machine disk is the same, except now it's read-only. Now it's not allowing changes to be made to that VMDK. All right. And it's created a new disk, WinClient01-000001.vmdk. That is my new disk, my snapshot disk. And any change that I make is going to be written to this one. And it's thin provision. See how it's only 1 meg in size? And that's the minimum file size for one of these VMDKs. And so it's just thin provisioned. It's sitting there. And if I start putting data into it, that's going to grow to contain all my changes. And it's the first snapshot. If I take another one and another one and another one, I'll have 000002 and 3 and 4 and so on as I continue to take more snapshots. Here, this is just my first one. Okay. I also have WinClient01-snapshot1.vmsn. Okay. What is that? Well, remember I said the snapshot is also going to back up my configuration. So if I were to go and add a second hard drive to this machine or change its network adapters, increase or decrease its memory, well, that memory configuration is a part of the snapshot, right? So if I take, let's go and modify the VM. So if I go to my VM, WinClient01, and I'm going to edit its hardware, right now it's set to have 2 gigs of RAM, okay? Let's say I change that, and I'm going to modify its memory. Maybe we'll cut it down to 1.5 gigs, right? So instead of 2 gigs of RAM, I'm going to drop it down to 1.5 gigs of RAM. And actually, I guess that should be 1532? Whatever, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to give it 1.5 gigs of memory, right? Well, if I were to restore the snapshot, it would remember that originally I had 2 gigs of RAM and it would put that back, right? The configuration of the VM is a part of that snapshot too. Now, if I power on the VM, this is Windows. I picked a great operating system for this because Windows, when it boots up, it's going to write to the hard drive. It's going to generate its page file. It's going to do all the various things. So just booting it up is going to cause some changes on that disk. So I'm going to power this virtual machine on, and it's going to start booting. Okay? And when it boots, think about what Windows does. It looks to the hard drive, it finds the operating system, it starts to load the kernel then fires up all the drivers then fire up the graphical user interface, and then we get to a login screen. But all along in the background, it's generating logs, it's resetting memory files, it's doing all sorts of various things that it does, which amounts to disk I/O. If this were a database server, once it's online, people start connecting and loading data into the database. The database starts to grow. Database has transaction log files. Those all make the hard drive grow too. Those would all be changes going into my snapshot disk. My snapshot disk that is thin provisioned. No matter how my original drives were configured, if they were thick provisioned, doesn't matter. It's now giving me the performance profile of being thin provisioned. All right, so I'm kind of stalling just while that machine boots up for a second. It doesn't take long. And once it starts to boot, I can go and look at the snapshot file. So there, I can see it's at a login screen now, right? And so I'm going to jump over to my data store and take a look at those files again, and we'll see where they've grown. Let me just pull that up real quick. And see that VMDK, the 000001, is now 17 megs in size. It hasn't grown a ton, but it has grown, right? It's starting to grow as the changes go in there. And as we continue to work with that disk, it's going to continue to change. So let's say that I want to go ahead and install Google Chrome in it, right? So I can go and, let me get connected to that machine. Where did I leave that thing? There we go. All right, so let me connect into that machine. And I'll make some changes. Maybe I want to install, let's do Notepad++, right? It's a little text editor a lot of us use. I don't remember their website, so we'll just do a quick search for that one. Good old Notepad++. So I'm going to download the file, and just downloading the file, that's going to generate something, right? If I go and download this, I don't know how big the file is. It's 4 whole megs in size, so that's not necessarily significant, but that's 4 megs of a file that I'm downloading. Where's that going to go? That's going to go into the snapshot file. The snapshot file was 17 megs a moment ago. Now it's going to bump up to 21 megs. That's my amazing math skills right there. And I'm going to do the install. Now, the file I downloaded was 4 megs. When I install it, it's probably going to extract it and get a little bit bigger. I'm writing to the hard drive to make these changes. And so this is additional stuff that's going to be put into that snapshot. So we'll get that installed. Yeah, not necessarily the biggest thing in the world, but you know, definitely going to occupy some space. Any changes that I make to the system, these are all becoming a part of it too. And they might even be simple changes, things like changing the wallpaper, right? If I change the wallpaper, that's got to go somewhere. And so I like to go Windows Classic anyway. So I'm going to bump this down to the Classic view. That's a change. Windows stores it in the registry. The registry is written to the hard drive. Now we've generated disk I/O that's part of that snapshot. And if I go back to my file system here, let me just refresh this, and we should see that snapshot file is growing. And sure enough, a minute ago it was only a couple of megs. Now it's 1.1 gigs in size. Why did it grow so much so fast? Well, we probably started using the page file, right? We started swapping down to that in addition to the other things. I downloaded a 4 meg file and I installed it, but it generated enough activity where that snapshot's now growing. And so you guys get an idea of how fast this can grow. And with a thin provision disk, that performance starts to suffer, right? So that's it in action. Now, if I take another snapshot right now, well, the machine is running. It's going to snapshot not just the hard drive, but it's also going to snapshot the configuration and what's in RAM. So let's see that. I'm going to take a snapshot of this virtual machine. So I'll take WinClient01. I'm going to go back to snapshots and take another snapshot, and I'll call this one after installing Notepad++. Okay, and you'll see down here where I've got my option to snapshot the virtual machine's memory, and that's lit up so that I can install it. You know, Quiesce, the guest file system, is not lit up. I thought I had VMware tools installed, but maybe I don't. Or it might not be supported on the desktop operating system. It might be a server only, I'm not sure. But I can snapshot the virtual machine's memory. That's the big difference about snapshotting a machine that is powered on. So I'm going to say OK to that, and it's going to take a snapshot. This snapshot will take longer because when I did it powered off, all it did was flag the VMDK as read-only and create a new VMDK. And then backed up that VMX file, which is very, very tiny. So that's why it was so fast. Now it's going to do all that same stuff, but it's also got to take whatever's in RAM and write that to the hard drive. Now I only gave it a gig and a half of RAM, so I'm going to write a gig and a half of data to the drive. Well, some of that RAM might have been empty. We're not necessarily using all of it, so it may be smaller. But be aware, if you're snapshotting a machine with like 30 gigs of RAM, then it could potentially have to write 30 gigs of data to the disk as part of making that snapshot, and that'll just take a moment. All right, let's take a look at what that data store looks like now. Browse back in there and we'll refresh that file list, and I expect to see a few different things in here now. Okay, first off, I've got my VMDK there, the 000001, and my other one's not showing up yet. Where is it? It will appear. Sometimes we just have to be a little patient, but we'll have that number 2 will show up. And then as I look down, we can see snapshot to VMEM, snapshot to VMSN. Okay, VMEM, that's the RAM. See how it's a gig and a half in size? That's my memory that's been written down there to the hard drive, so that virtual machine at that exact state. And the configuration file down here is a whopping 1.2 megs that's been written. That includes the BIOS configuration too, so that one's wrapped up. But the VMDK, oh, there it is. Was that there all the? That was there all along, wasn't it? Shoot.
Yes.
Wes is making fun of me now. So there's number 2 that I couldn't see a moment ago. It was invisible. I swear, if we rewind this, it'd be invisible. So there's number 2, right? There's that disk, and it's already up to 967 megs, and I haven't even touched it, right? That's just changing page file is usually what generates that. So now I've got a second one. Now I'm very similar to that diagram that I showed you guys earlier, this guy, where I've got my base VMDK, snapshot 1, snapshot 2. When I start working with this disk, I'm having to read potentially 3 different files when I read from the hard drive.
Now, Don, is there a way that if we've decided that we no longer need like an 8 a.m. snapshot, is there a way to go back to the 7 a.m. snapshot, or are we now just left with 8 a.m.?
You can jump around all over the place with this stuff. So technically, the way mine works is I've got my base Windows 7 install. That was my first snapshot. My second snapshot was when I was getting. Well, actually, my second snapshot was what? I was getting ready to install Google Chrome is what I said, but we did Notepad++. So that's prior to me doing the install. And then I've got the snapshot after I did the install. So we installed Notepad++ and then took another snapshot. So I could roll back to prior to installing Notepad++. I could restore back all the way to the base image that we had before. And the important thing to remember is that when you roll back, that doesn't delete the snapshot. The snapshot stays there. You're just not using it anymore. Because you might roll back and then choose to roll forward later. Maybe something went wrong with the software install, so you roll back. But then you figure out what the problem was. You could just roll forward and fix it. I rarely do that, and the main reason is if something went wrong with the install, then it's easier for me to just redo it and do it right the second time. The other thing is you roll back and you start making changes. If you roll forward to that snapshot, it's no longer in line, right? It's like in Star Trek where they have the alternate futures. You've got this fork in the road that's happened, and so if you try and roll forward to one fork, it doesn't have what happened in the other one, and now everybody's got a goatee. So it's a whole mess. So it actually keeps track of that for us. If I go back into my vCenter screen and I take that virtual machine, right? What I've been doing so far is I'll right-click on it and I'll go to snapshots and take a snapshot. But you can go down to revert to latest snapshot, and that'll just roll you back to the last one you took. Or you can go to manage snapshots and you'll see all the snapshots that you've got, and you can roll back to any one of them. So I can roll back to the base machine as it was at the beginning of the show, or I can roll back to the snapshot that we took of prior to doing the Chrome install, or I can roll back to, well, after installing Notepad++, but that's where I am right now, right? Not exactly. Changes have happened since then, and so I've got you are here. And when we look at this, it's just kind of a step, and so it's kind of confusing. Like, why track it this way? Well, you might have more than one fork in the road. If I roll back to this snapshot prior to installing Google Chrome, well, that's going to move me back. I'll still have after installing Notepad++. All right. Now, pay attention to these icons here. See how I've got 4 different icons. The circle dot, that's where we are right now. All right. This original one is just telling us that's the base image. That's the base machine before we even really got started. That's the first snapshot. But the other ones have either a clock or a clock with a green arrow, right? The clock just means it's a snapshot. All of your snapshots will have a clock. The green arrow means that the machine was turned on when we did that snapshot. The machine was turned off here on here. They're both snapshots, but a different state for the VM. When you roll back to a snapshot, it'll put it back to the state that it was in. If I roll back to this snapshot, the machine will power off, right? Let me do that. I'm going to choose prior to installing Chrome, and down here I'm going to hit the revert to button. And so that's going to revert us back. And it's asking if I want to take a snapshot of how the system is right now. So I might want to do that, or I'm just going to say no and let it restore. So it's rolling me back to that snapshot, okay? And if I close this and look at my recent tasks, you'll see it goes really fast. Well, right here it's showing me the virtual machine's powered on. If I refresh my screen, I should see the machine is now powered off. It was powered off when I took the snapshot. At least I thought it was. Did I roll back to a powered on one? Let's see how it's actually showing here. Oh, I guess, oh, you know what? It hasn't rolled us back yet. Yeah, Notepad++ is still there. So it hasn't actually rolled us back yet. I gotta wait for that task to complete. You know, I must not have clicked the button. I'm looking at my recent tasks, and that's a create snapshot task. It didn't actually roll me back. So let's go back and do that again. Always a good idea to verify the snapshot actually rolled back. So I'm going to go back here and take that prior to installing Google Chrome. That's what I want to revert to. I'm going to hit the revert to button. It's telling me the current state will be lost. Should I revert to the snapshot? Oh, you know, I thought this was offering to take a new one. I didn't bother to read it, and I should have. So I told it no, which means it didn't do anything. So I'll tell it yes this time, because that'll make it actually work, which is kind of useful. All right, so now it's actually doing it. And we should see it in our recent tasks. There we go. And now when I refresh that machine, it should be powered off. It pays to read the pop-up messages sometimes. And I can see it is powered off. It was powered off when I took the snapshot, so now it's powered off here too. Okay. And now, if I were to power this on, I'm in an alternate dimension. I'm in a dimension of what would life have been like had I not installed Notepad++? Had I not done that, right? Well, this is where we would be at. And if I power this up, it's going to boot up, and now it's alternate universe Windows 7, right? And if I go to manage my snapshots, I'll see a fork in the road, right? The you are here is going one way, and installing Notepad++ goes a different way, alternate futures, right? So if I go back to snapshots and manage snapshots, now I see that I've got prior to installing Google Chrome, which is what we just rolled back to, and then I've got you are here at the same level as after installing Notepad++. There are two different futures for this snapshot, right? And so that's why we have to have a management screen like this to track those. And as you create more and more snapshots, this can get more and more complex, and it's easy to lose track of it. And that's why it's nice to have it all laid out right here to make it easier for us to do, right? Now, I rolled back to a snapshot when the machine was powered off. If I roll back to a snapshot while the machine is powered on, I'll get a different experience. It'll restore me back, and the machine will already be powered on. So for example, if I take after installing snapshot here, and I revert back to it, okay, see how it's saying suspend the virtual machine when reverting to a selected snapshot? Do I want to just yank the power out of the machine as it is right now, or do I want to suspend it first, okay? And it's just warning me that I'm going to lose my changes. I'll tell it to go ahead and suspend. And then it's going to send me back over. So now it's going to put me right back to after installing Notepad++, and you are here is now underneath that. And so if I go back to that virtual machine, well, I'm disconnected here. If I go back to that virtual machine, it's suspended because I told it to suspend it, and if I resume it, it'll be back on. If I had not told it to resume it, then, to suspend it, then it would have actually been on right when I flipped over to it. But now here I am, and I should have, whoops, Notepad++ right there, okay? So pretty easy to navigate between these snapshots, pretty easy to take them. The key thing to remember is that performance risk that we have with it. Now, I've got a bit more I need to talk about with snapshots, and I know we're low on time, and I didn't think we need a part 2 on this one, Wes, but I think we actually are going to need a part 2 so I can tackle the rest of it.
All right, well, maybe we should stop this before, who knows what alternate ending we end up in. We're pushing the space-time continuum here anyway, so we'll do that. We'll go into a part 2, and we'll figure out what universe we're in when we come back. Anything else for this one, Don, or are you just going to hold it to part 2?
Yeah, let's roll into part 2, because we need to talk about, I talked about the performance risks and how we need to keep a good rein on our snapshots, and that's what we're going to see in the next episode, is how to control those, delete them, consolidate them, and all the other maintenance tasks we need to do.
All right, well, thanks for being here, and I enjoyed this episode. Look forward to seeing you guys out there in part 2. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.